Shrouded in mist and isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 350 miles off the South American coast of Costa Rica, lies a deserted island called Cocos.
Cocos is hidden away, and for that reason, it was more a myth. Some weren't sure that it existed.
In the 18th and early 19th century, ruthless pirates paid regular visits to Cocos.
There are so many accounts of how pirates buried treasures on this island.
Some say that millions of dollars of gold and precious stones still lie hidden under its coconut trees, rocks, and caves.
If someone was talking about Treasure Island on those days, always was Cocos.
Over the years, hundreds of men have battled against the island's incessant rain, the searing heat, and unyielding soil to search for the treasure. Some stayed for months, most left within days. But one man spent 17 years on the island looking for it. His name was August Gisler.
There was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
To some treasure hunters, his was a magnificent passion, but to others, it's a tale of greed and obsession. This is the story of August Gisler's amazing quest to find the pirate treasure on Cocos Island. (1881). A British sailing ship was en route to Hawaii's capital city, Honolulu. On board was a 23-year-old German engineer named August Gisler.
He's the son of a knife manufacturer, I think the third of 11 children. One can imagine that that's potentially a stifling place to be. He was expected to follow his elder brother into the knife manufacturing business and, in the family firm, and instead Gisler put to sea.
Gisler's voyages took him all over the world, and along the way, he met some unusual companions. Gisler befriended a young Portuguese traveler, Manuel Cabral, and they fell deep into conversation.
We were sitting a lot of time together with this young man. They're drinking a lot of rum, and they were telling a lot about families and things.
Over the weeks that they were at sea together, they grew to trust each other and appreciate each other's company.
One evening, a sailor by the name of Old Jack walked by. And Cabral said that he looked like a pirate. Gisler told him those days were over and asked why he mentioned the word pirate. Cabral answered, "Old Jack fits the description of my grandfather's life. He was a sailor and sailed this very ocean."
Cabral mentioned that the reason he was so far from home was that he was hoping one day to reach an island where there was something very special hidden. And he produced from an oilskin folder an account written by his grandfather of his life.
The diary was the autobiography of a pirate in the early 1800s. Cabral's grandfather wrote of how, when he was a young fisherman, he and his boat were blown off course with a broken mast and picked up by a pirate ship.
They were pressed into service and found themselves working for one of the greatest and most notorious and most charismatic pirates of the day, which was Don Pedro Benito, Bloody Sword Bonito.
That was the moment when Gisler was hooked by the story. He must have been really fascinated by this diary of a real pirate.
It was a tale of buccaneers, Spanish galleons, and murder on the Pacific. Piracy was a lucrative industry in the early 19th century, and bloody sword Benito ruled the waves.
They would sometimes attack villages on the shore, sometimes they would attack a Spanish galleon. One very famous occasion, they took some priests along with their treasure on board.
One section of the diary made Gisela's heart race. It told of a time when the pirates had just stormed a Spanish galleon loaded with treasure. And they were now looking for somewhere to bury it all.
You can't put in at port with a whole load of jewels without raising some notice. People are going to wonder, where did it come from?
You've got to put the stuff somewhere safe.
You can sell tobacco in any old port and it'll move quickly, but you know, you have a golden chalice. It's a little bit harder to work with.
One particular passage really drew Gisela in. Cabral's grandfather described where they were going to bury the treasure.
A few days after our capture, the lookout reported an island ahead. From far off, we could see a huge waterfall and high mountains on each side. Three boats landed the treasure on a shore near a coconut grove. There was a stream running close into the sea.
Gisela read how Cabral's grandfather and the captain followed the stream for half a mile inland and came across another coconut grove where they decided to conceal their plunder.
Now, there were no numbered Swiss bank accounts in those days, so it had to be put safely in a hiding place that had to have two distinct qualities. One, it must be very difficult to find. And two, it must be possible for you to locate it because you have certain information which no one else has got access to.
Gisela now read what seemed to reveal the exact location of where Cabral's grandfather buried the pirate treasure.
I dug a hole in the ground. The treasure was piled into the hole. The captain took exact bearings, but he did not tell me what they were. I took my own bearings from the mouth of the stream in line with the round rock, which is about 600 feet west by south from the mouth of the stream and about 20 feet back of the coconut grove.
The document was completely unique, and I think Gisela knew this right away. It gave detailed descriptions of what the treasure was and where the treasure was buried. Landmarks, for instance, numbers of paces from the spot where it would be buried.
You can understand how exciting it must have been for August Gisela when he's on board the ship. And it becomes more and more clear that what he is looking at is a pirate document with essentially directions to the treasure.
These were the most extraordinary pages Gisela had ever read. He now realized that not only did they give precise directions as to where the treasure was buried, they had never been published or shown to anyone else before. But there was something missing.
While Gisela had an awful lot of information about the whereabouts of this buried treasure, He lacked one crucial thing, and that was the name of the island itself.
"169 days after leaving London, Gisler's ship finally reached Hawaii's capital, Honolulu. By now, he's desperate to know the island's name and needs to raise enough money for an expedition to go and search for the treasure.
Gisler arrived in Hawaii and he immediately began looking for work. Took a while, but eventually ended up finding some on a plantation.
While Gisler worked on a banana farm, he had a chance encounter in a bar with a man named Bartels. Here, he heard of another link to the buried treasure. Bartels told him about his wife's father, a man named Old Mac.
Gisler was to learn that Old Mac had actually known the pirate Benito Bonito as well. He'd been involved in the capture of a Spanish galleon off the coast of Acapulco and had sailed to an island where the treasure was buried.
Gisler's ears pricked up. He wondered if this was the same island as the one in Cabral's grandfather's diary. Bartels handed Gisler Old Mac's chart and said that he had set off in 1852 to search for Benito's buried treasure on an island called Cocos, but had run out of money before he got there.
Old Mac was in the possession of what appeared to be pirate maps and instructions to the treasure on an island that he knew as Cocos Island.
But where was this mysterious island? The chart revealed an island with 2 mountains and 2 bays at the northeast and northwest ends. The island's position was latitude 527 degrees north and longitude 87 degrees west. Compass bearings from the 2 points were given where these 2 lines cross, and the treasure's hiding place was marked. And there were even more clues.
When Gisler examined these papers, to his excitement and interest, he discovered that the description of Cocos Island was almost exactly the same as the island that Cabral had told him about.
Critically, Cabral's grandfather's tale talked about 2 mountains. So did Old Mac's charts.
He has finally found out from the Bartels the name of the island, and it's Cocos.
Cocos is famous for buried treasure because there are so many accounts of how pirates buried vast hoards of gold, rubies, and silver on this island, and for various reasons couldn't come back to retrieve it. In many cases because they were hanged or lost at sea.
Gisler is now convinced that the treasure could still be there and is determined to find it. Gisler wrote how before he left, Bartels gave him one word of caution.
Don't take too many hands to the island, and don't let a living soul know what you're after. You might not only lose your treasure, but also your life.
Ignoring the warning, Gisler eventually managed to get a ride on a Swedish sailing ship, whose captain promised to drop him off on Cocos on their way to Chile. But very quickly, Bartel's words seemed to come into play. The ship was poorly manned, and the winds and sea were against them. First, they were hit by a storm. And then worse. They had no winds at all. Gisler described his journey.
We were only 350 miles from the island and thought we could easily make it in a week's sailing, but very light winds prevailed, and 14 days elapsed before we sighted Cocos. At that point, we were becalmed again, and that night we lost sight of the island completely.
The Swedish sailing ship drifted around the Pacific Ocean for another week, and then finally, the captain was forced to abandon the Cocos Island drop-off. They had no option but to carry on to Chile. 73 days after leaving Honolulu, and over 3,000 miles away from Cocos Island, they arrived in Chile, South America, with Gisler still on board. In Chile, the Swedish crew introduced him to a captain of a whaling company who told Gisler he had been to Cocos Island on several occasions.
Once, in 1875, he had fallen in with an American expedition looking for the treasure where they had been digging close to the beach. This interested me, as the plans I had in my possession pointed to the cache being a good way inland.
Over the next few months, Gisler talked to local merchants and dockside workers to gain funds for another trip to Cocos Island.
It takes him some time to get himself together and arrange his affairs, but he manages in Chile to really incorporate a group of investors who are willing to travel with him to Cocos Island.
In late February 1889, and 8 years after first hearing Cabral's grandfather's story, Gisler finally set foot on Cocos Island. Now at last, Gisler can pursue his dream.
Cocos Island lies 550 kilometers off the coast of Costa Rica. It's part of the same volcanic chain as the Galapagos, so it just juts up out of the Pacific deep. It comes from something like 4 kilometers below sea level. It's just the top of a mountain peak. So what you see above the water is just the beginning. It's a jungle with mist and waterfalls cascading off the side of these granite cliffs. And it's really alone out there in the Pacific Ocean.
No permanent human settlement has ever survived here. Now Gisler and his men were the only ones on the island. Over the next few weeks, as the expedition party made a base camp, Gisler got the lay of the land. Looking up at the two mountains dominating the island, he opened his chart to survey the land.
The two were marked on my chart. From these mountains, 2 lines were drawn which joined a good way inland, and a large square had been drawn round the point where the lines intersected. The writing on the plan was in Spanish, but the mate translated it for us as follows. In 1821, we buried treasure here of immense value. After we had buried the treasure, we planted a coconut tree on top and took bearings by compass, which showed locations northeast by east half east to the East Mountain and north 10 degrees east to the West Mountain.
Gisela used the chart as a marker and set the party to work.
They uprooted trees. They searched caves. And they dug fresh approaches to existing tunnels. But all to no avail. And one by one, the party who had come so enthusiastically with Gisela began to drift away from the island until only 4 of them remained.
Gisela and his last 3 companions continued their search. They dug under every palm tree around the square marked on the chart. But after 10 months, exhausted and disillusioned, they left the island in December 1889 and returned to Chile. The following October, Gisela was back on the island. This time, he had a better equipped and supplied treasure hunting party. And very soon, he seemed to be getting results. One morning, Gisela dug up some 18th century Spanish gold coins. But the few gold coins proved to be their only find.
The expedition spent several months on the island digging and boring until we were forced to admit that we had no sure signs that we would strike anything in the near future. We therefore hove up anchor.
Gisela was now tormented with self-doubt. Had he fallen for the oldest treasure hunter folly of them all?
Everybody begins with a treasure map or some secret information that they believe that they are the only people in possession of. And you think, this will take me a week and I'll dig something up and I'll be rich and that will be it.
He didn't find the places they were described, and he didn't find the exact positions. I mean, that's a volcanic area, and the shape of the island is changing a lot.
Gisela went to the island and found that by following the instructions that he had, he didn't find the treasure. And I believe that the realization suddenly dawned on him that following these specific instructions was not going to work.
That realization was an epiphany for August Gisela. Although his best endeavors to find the treasure had all been failures, he would have to try an entirely new approach.
After a number of unsuccessful attempts with one small expedition after another, Gisler realized that the problem was so immense, it was not going to be solved by one of these hit-and-run missions.
The key to any new approach, Gisler realized, was to expand the search area.
His plan was that he would go to the most likely place where the treasure was and start digging. And if that didn't work, he would increase his search area, increasingly larger and larger and larger.
The task of Gisler's proposal was immense. It would mean digging up the entire island and would take years. So the only way to do it, he believed, was to live on the island, and if necessary, devote his whole life to it.
I think it was clear to Gisler after his early attempts to search for the treasure that logistics were a major issue, and logistics are expensive. And financing it all himself could happen once, maybe twice, but I think the amount of effort and perhaps the extended nature of the search would necessitate a different kind of access.
To Gisler, the idea of spending long periods of time on the island made complete sense. Over the past 2 years, he had got to know the island's terrain and climate well. The soil, he believed, was rich and ready for cultivating, and there was an abundance of wild pigs, goats, and deer. He thought that if the land was farmed, it could easily be self-supporting for as long as he wanted it to be. Gisler then hit on the idea of forming an agricultural community to live on the island with him. Together, they would hunt for the treasure.
He wanted to colonize the island of Cocos. And he was claiming that he could grow all sorts of things on the island. He could grow the best tobacco. He could grow much more of it than they could per acre in Cuba. Lots of different varieties of bananas. Given that the island is mainly volcanic rock, and it's only got an area of about 5 miles by 2 miles, it was amazing how much Gisler was claiming.
He petitioned the president of Costa Rica to set up an agricultural colony that could be supplied by mailboat once a month, and provisions could be brought on. That would facilitate really a longer-term involvement with Cocos.
In July 1891, the Costa Rican president agreed to Gisler's plan and granted him certain rights to develop the island agriculturally.
He got permission from the Costa Rican authorities to set up a colony, and they agreed that if he could bring 50 families from Germany, they could live on it.
Gisler now had to raise the funds and to find 50 German families. With the colony rights in his pocket, he traveled around Europe, promoting his island scheme.
On those days, the German emperor was very interested to increase German colonies. So, and also this was a little bit the spirit of the days.
After Europe, Gisler then tried his luck in America. The New York Times would write of him, "Gisler is a breathing replica of Michelangelo's heroic statue of Moses. His reddish beard reaches to his waist. His hair is luxuriant on a splendidly poised head. His eyes are as clear and as searching as an eagle's. His nose is classic. His voice is profoundly mellow, fitting the man to perfection. His height is 6 feet 3 inches. He is built like a wedge, as a man should be, with massive shoulders. His hand is as big as the hand of Providence and so hard that his clenched fist is used as a spike maul. Nowhere were there any takers, not in Europe or America. Gisler was now desperate to get back to Cocos, but he was unable to raise the funds or the people to form a colony. He appealed again to the Costa Rican government to help him.
I explained to the president that it was impossible to raise any capital on the concession I had received in 1891, and he requested me to put down what I now desired, and he would see what he could do.
Gisler spelled out exactly the terms he would need to make the settlement work.
My demands were a gift of 1/2 of the island for myself, the other half to be laid out in sections for the settlers I proposed to bring. It took some time to win my point, but eventually the terms were granted.
This was the breakthrough Gisler had wanted. Now married to his wife Mary, Gisler again returned to Europe. This time, there were plenty of takers, and he was able to secure funds from his relatives and friends to transport the colonists over to the island.
My wife went with me to the island on the 13th of December 1894. From New York we brought lumber and building materials, provisions, and seeds. In Panama, we secured tropical plants, chickens, ducks, and turkeys.
The German farming families began to build houses, and it looked as if everything was going to be all right.
Cocos Island represented everything that Germany of the time wasn't. It was wild, untamed. It's completely raw. It's isolated. It didn't involve being one of 11 children in a family enterprise, making knives. It was him doing his thing.
The first thing we did was to clear the land to plant cane, bananas, vegetables, and coffee.
On November the 11th, 1897, Gisler was even appointed governor of Cocos Island by the government of Costa Rica.
You head so far down a path, that path becomes who you are. And I think he was really happy to be the governor of Cocos Island.
At last, Gisler had the time, the resources, and the people to look for the treasure. He made regular explorations along the shorelines, and one day, there seemed to be another breakthrough. He came across more Spanish gold coins.
He offered parts of the island to his family members. So he really thought that he was securing his family's legacy for generations.
But Gisler's dreams quickly began to evaporate. The government boat requested by Gisler to drop supplies off to the island failed to show up after only making a few trips.
As no more ships came in, it was not long before we ran short of provisions. One of the settlers fell ill, his limbs became swollen, and soon after he died.
Gisler's problems didn't end there. The German colonists, who were promised the land of plenty, were struggling to grow vegetables in the tropical paradise.
Cocos Island has rather unusual soil. It's a grey type of sand or grey type of clay which holds water a few feet down and makes it very difficult indeed to grow anything.
Gisler knew he had to get more provisions if he and the colonists were going to survive and locate the treasure. He built a boat and took 4 men across the water to Costa Rica with him to help with the supplies. When he got there was another setback. As their boat was loaded, 3 of the men refused to return with him.
There was no use in trying to reason with these men and telling them what a cowardly thing it was to leave their wives. To bring the settlers over had cost a lot of money, but I thought it would be cheaper in the long run to get rid of them.
But Gisler's problems didn't stop there. When he returned, he found that the situation on the island had deteriorated even more. A plague of rats was attacking the colonists' children.
The island is full of rats, and so it didn't really go well for the colonists. I think that they had a desire or a vision of themselves as wealthy plantation owners, you know, in the Pacific, not as subsistence farmers whose children were being attacked by vermin.
The colonists now rebelled at the island's harsh conditions.
Most of them didn't want to really work hard, and coming from Germany, they are not used to this climate. Wet, 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 and humid and hot. And then they had to build a house, they have to cook their food, and they have to do everything.
As the colonists turned on Gisler, he confronted them.
One of the things about Gisler was not only his mental and physical strength and stamina, but his natural ability to command.
He said that on this island he's the governor, the judge, jury, and the executioner.
I thought they would raise crops and get rich, but in a short time they raised an insurrection instead. I declared martial law as governor of the island, and with my big pistols pointed in the faces of the Germans, I scared them into submission. They laid down what arms they had, and peace was restored.
Yet another problem hit Gisler's plans. His provisions quickly ran out, and he had to go back to the mainland for more. While Gisler was away, the island received some unexpected and unwelcome visitors. A British warship dropped anchor in Cocos Bay. Under the command of an Admiral Palliser, several platoons were dispatched ashore with shovels, picks, and a large quantity of dynamite. For the next few days, they proceeded to dig and blast huge holes all over the island, hoping to find the treasure. As Gisler's wife Mary tried to stop them, she was told to mind her own business. Yet despite all the craters they made, the British didn't find any treasure. When Gisler returned with new supplies, he complained about the incident.
In fairness to the Admiral's superiors and British diplomacy, let us say here that the Admiral was severely reprimanded for his unwanted intrusion on Cocos Island.
But it was a very minor victory, because Gisler's colony was disintegrating all around him.
It was a very miserable community because you and your immediate friends and neighbours were struggling just to keep alive, and all hopes of getting rich had long since gone. What had looked so promising at the beginning when the colonists arrived began to weaken and fade, and one by one they decided that there was no future for them as farmers on the Cocos plantation.
In 1902, Gisela and Mary were the only ones left on the island. But even then, Gisela was determined not to give up. Gisela had now been searching for over 16 years. And despite all his suffering, he was still convinced he could find the pirates' buried treasure. Out looking for it, he came across a large sign, hand-carved in the bark of a tree.
It said, "The bird is gone." And the question is, what does that mean? Who wrote it?
Was it a cryptic message? Did the bird mean the treasure? Had someone taken it? Had all Gisela's efforts been in vain?
I think the thing that is poignant to me is, do they know that the treasure is gone, or do they think that the treasure is gone? And I wonder how much that played on Gisela's mind all of the time after he'd found out.
Gisela was distraught. Questions began racing through his mind. Did one of the pirates return to the island to retrieve the treasure only to find out one of his shipmates had been there before him? Things were now really getting very desperate for him. No ship had called at the island for nearly a year. He had no ammunition left to shoot game, and he knew he had to make another trip to the mainland for them to survive.
There was no one on the island anymore besides his wife. It must have been a very great relationship. I mean, really very romantic. Every other woman probably would have left and said, well, I have this crazy guy.
Gisela patched up his small handmade boat again. He had no material left to make a sail, so he created one with some sheets off their bed. Gisela told his wife Mary he would be away for no longer than 4 to 6 weeks and set off to buy the supplies. But things didn't go to plan. As soon as he left Cocos, Gisela hit a terrible storm. And ended up in Panama, over 200 miles on from his original destination, the mainland of Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Gisela had left Mary completely abandoned.
So you have his wife living on the island on her own, one woman on her own, on an island in the middle of the Pacific, with only the barest rudiments for capturing her food. She created traps, she caught things. Did she eat rats? Perhaps.
There was no one taking care for her, and she could easily have died on the island.
You can imagine how difficult that must have been for her.
Gisela finally made his way back to Cocos Island 6 months later. But this experience and the constant struggle to exist on the island finally got the better of them. Gisela left the island with Mary in 1908. They settled in New York, where they were supported by relatives. So does that mean that Gisela's efforts to find the pirates' treasure on Cocos Island was all in vain? Gisela had spent 17 years looking for the buried treasure on Cocos Island. But all he had found was a total of 33 gold pieces, minted between 1793 and 1799.
I wonder whether, looking back at the end of his life, did he feel as if those gold coins had somehow lured him into staying on when he should have given it up years before?
In the end, it was just a man who was desperately convinced that there was something on the island, doing whatever he could to find it, but didn't have any new evidence to be able to do it.
It's almost as though each coin that he had found had whispered to him like some mischievous sprite, "There is money here. Go on, August, keep digging."
Gisela died on the 8th of August, 1935. He was 78. In his will, he left half of Cocos Island to friends and relatives. He had estimated the value of his legacy to be around $200,000. But when the beneficiaries approached the Cocos government to claim their inheritance, they were told that because Gisela was only a temporary governor and never owned the island, his will was worthless. But there is another way at looking at Gisela's life. He may not have found what he was looking for, but it's a magnificent tribute to the human spirit that he endured for so long.
Most people that go to the island can only cope with maybe 1 or 2 weeks of digging, because in the end it tires you, it saps you. Even to have the physical and mental fortitude to survive on that island and to dig on that island for a few weeks is phenomenal. To do what Gisela did, which was to never give up, and to spend 17 years looking for the treasure, is a mark of an extraordinary human being.
Once he'd set out on his quest, there was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
Obsessed, maybe, but certainly passionate, certainly resourceful, and he was basically living his dream. Who can fault him for that?
The following words are believed to be the last he ever wrote.
The treasure is on the island, but it will take money and a good deal of effort to unearth it. I have gone through many hardships and dangers, and perhaps shall do so again, but this will not keep me away.
According to legend, somewhere in Texas lies buried a vast treasure of Spanish gold. At the turn of the 20th century, one man is on a mission to find it. His name is Dave Arnold.
He was obsessed with this legend. He wasn't going to let anything stop him and prevent him from seeking it.
Guided by a cryptic old map, he unearths 3 mysterious stones. Chiseled into their surfaces are web-like pictorial codes.
No one seems to know what it means.
Convinced these rocks are keys to finding the treasure, Arnold begins a 7-year quest. One that leads to a mysterious death, financial ruin, and an ancient curse.
Leave it alone. You'll have nothing but heartache from this.
This is the story of a quest to find a fabulous lost treasure and unravel the mystery of the Spider Rocks. The story begins in 1902, when Dave Arnold arrived in the small town of Haskell, Texas.
Descriptions of them have him as a large, very fat man with striking white hair. Every person in Haskell notices this new person coming into town. What's he here for? Who's he going to see? And what does this man want?
Some say Arnold was a miner, recently returned to the US from Mexico. But it soon became obvious he was in Haskell for a purpose. He was there to find treasure.
Dave Arnold is looking for anything that might have a dollar sign attached to it. He makes no excuse. He lets people know that he is looking for something.
But those who met Arnold later recalled he was guarded about precisely what this treasure was.
We know some of what he's looking for. We don't know everything he's looking for, and I'm not so sure he wants everyone to know what he's seeking.
But Dave Arnold was certain about one thing. The treasure he sought was somewhere in Texas, and it was originally Spanish. For over 130 years, Texas was part of New Spain, a colonial territory which at its height stretched from Central America to Northern California. The Spaniards left behind a rich history of myths and legends related to fabulous lost treasures. And many of these came from their centuries-long quest to find new sources of metals in the Americas.
West Texas country is full of copper. Spaniards were certainly looking for copper. They were looking for lead. Anytime you have those metals, you always have a little gold and silver mixed in with it.
But for Arnold, locating a cache of lost Spanish gold promised to be a huge challenge. In 1902, Texas was the largest state in the US and almost completely wild.
There are no roadways, there are no road maps, there are no highways, there are no automobiles. This is wilderness, and these people, it takes them, a day to travel 15 miles.
Finding lost Spanish gold would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. But Dave Arnold had a secret weapon. A tattered sheepskin map he believed was an old Spanish treasure map. It was covered with a variety of strange symbols and landmarks. and Arnold was very secretive about the information it contained.
No one saw the map closely. He didn't allow the map out of his possession. So if others got a glimpse of it, it was only a brief glimpse.
And he kept that map well guarded, including sleeping, with it under his pillow at nights.
Arnold believed his precious sheepskin map led to buried treasure. But he had a problem. He didn't understand many of its cryptic markings and symbols. Luckily for Arnold, there was a man in Haskell who might be able to help. His name was Caleb Terrell.
Caleb LaFawn Terrell, he's a druggist in Haskell, about 1900, and he has an interest in the flora and the fauna. He had glass showcases full of fossils and all unusual type things that were found in the area.
Evidence suggests Dr. Terrell was interested in more than natural history. He too was a treasure hunter. Like Arnold, he owned a mysterious map covered in bizarre symbols.
Dave Arnold must have looked for Dr. Terrell because he knew that he had a map that had some of the same symbols that Dave Arnold was seeking.
Dr. Terrell had already been involved in a search, at least as early as 1897. Somehow, Dave Arnold discovers that fact, and so Dave Arnold shows up in Haskell, probably to share information with Dr. Terrell of what he knows and what he has, and hoping that Dr. Terrell can share information as to some of the meaning of those symbols.
History does not record exactly what took place during Arnold and Terrell's meeting. But the two men joined forces and began an incredible quest for the lost Spanish treasure. Arnold and Terrell quickly identified a site to search first. An area 20 miles west of Haskell, on the Salt Fork of the Brazos River. The treasure hunters set up camp here in spring 1902. Arnold and Terrell recruited local ranchers to help dig the site and immediately put them to work. For weeks, they shoveled ton after ton of soil. It's probable they uncovered chunks of slag and pieces of copper. All evidence the area was once mined for metals. But they found no trace of lost Spanish treasure.
It must have been frustrating for Arnold to have spent all of this time excavating areas that he thought would be the location of the treasure, and to find that few bits of information are coming out. Very few artifacts are coming out.
The truth was, neither Arnold nor Dr. Terrell could accurately read the sheepskin map's cryptic symbols to pinpoint the lost Spanish treasure.
Dave Arnold can't proceed with anything. He's stumped as to where to go next and what to do next.
Without help, his chances of striking it rich were close to zero. Then Dave Arnold caught a lucky break. His lack of progress had been noticed.
Dave Arnold is being watched. He sees this sheep herder where there really should not be a herd of sheep.
The sheep herder was a Mexican. He and Arnold had a meeting a few weeks into the excavation.
Arnold meets the sheep herder. Sometime in the course of that first conversation, treasure is mentioned.
The sheep herder stated that he knew all about the lost Spanish gold, and that Arnold was not the only person who had worked out where it might be buried.
He tells Dave Arnold that it's not that much of a mystery in Mexico. Certain priests are aware of this site, and he seems to know far more about it than Dave Arnold does.
Reports also state the sheep herder told Arnold something else. He could read the sheepskin map.
Arnold shows the sheep herder the map, and the sheep herder is reading Arnold's map in a way that Arnold never considered, thought of, or possibly never even knew how to read.
The Mexican stated the sheepskin map didn't reveal the actual location of the treasure. It would take them to another map carved in stone. That rock would lead them to the gold. They would know the stone because it would be marked with a very specific symbol.
The Mexican sheep herder is apparently emphasizes that there's a certain hieroglyphic H that needs to be found, which is the clue to solving the mystery.
That immediately strikes Arnold's interest and excites Arnold to the point to where he thinks, I may have a real chance on finding this treasure.
The way forward seemed clear. Finding the stone inscribed with an H would bring Arnold a step closer to uncovering the lost treasure. The Mexican indicated a new area for Arnold's men to excavate. They began removing the stubborn Texas dirt. Soon, one of the men's shovels struck a rock. Arnold brushed away the dirt and carefully lifted away a small, flat stone. Underneath were 3 copper ornaments. One was shaped like a dagger. Another, a strange-looking key. The third was a square with notches cut into its sides. Arnold didn't fully understand what these objects meant. The treasure hunter now brushed away more dirt and revealed an artifact unlike anything he'd seen before. An inscribed stone, covered with Roman numerals, numbers, and curious Spanish letters.
According to the eyewitnesses, this is the most elaborately carved rock that they'd ever seen.
At the center was a series of concentric circles. And to one side was the distinctive old-fashioned letter H. Just as the Mexican sheep herder had described.
Nothing like it had ever been seen by any of the men who were doing the digging. With its concentric lines and various symbols and marks on them. It must have been a sight to behold.
The stone's peculiar web-like design earned it the nickname Spider Rock. It contained no clue as to when it was made or who buried it. But Dave Arnold was convinced that this new discovery held the key to uncovering the lost Spanish treasure.
It's a highlight in his life. It's a major highlight, a major discovery to him. Obviously, he's quite excited about it. He thinks he's on the verge of finding the treasure.
But again, he hit the same problem. Neither Arnold nor Dr. Terrell had any idea how to read the stone's curious hieroglyphics. So they turned again to the Mexican. The sheepherder studied the Spider Rock's mysterious markings. He made a series of strange predictions. Arnold's team would find a stone. Underneath would be human remains. Nearby, they'd discover a huge animal bone and a variety of man-made artifacts.
It seems that Arnold becomes quite excited about looking for them. They may not have gotten to the treasure yet, but Arnold seems to be encouraged.
Convinced these clues were somehow connected to finding Spanish gold, Arnold immediately started digging. Again, one of his men's shovels struck rock. Underneath was a horrifying sight.
They find the cadavers with a great stench. And of course, I'm sure they are mystified as to what this means.
Reports state the Mexican claimed the bodies were Native American slaves whose spirits guarded a fabulous treasure. But that was not all the men found. 19 paces away, they uncovered a giant prehistoric animal bone. And nearby, what appeared to be a pair of silver epaulets, possibly from a Spanish officer's uniform. Everything was just as the Mexican had predicted to Arnold.
It's verification of the truth of the map, because if these things that the Mexican sheepherder told him about on the map are true, then it only stands to reason that the gold is still there as well.
Arnold pumped the Mexican for more information. Where was the treasure? The sheepherder again studied the Spider Rock's cryptic markings and identified one that indicated a small hill. Here, he said, Arnold could possibly find treasure.
Arnold becomes very excited as anyone has ever seen him at that time, and he decides now or never we are going to go find this treasure.
Arnold's team redoubled their efforts and began leveling the hill, cutting through layer after layer of Texas soil.
By the time he's through, he has almost leveled the area known as Spider Rock Hill.
But not everyone was happy with Arnold's methods. It's reported the Mexican sheepherder and Dave Arnold's relationship started to deteriorate.
We're told that the sheep herder was upset when they scraped all that off into the canyon, but he possibly realized to solve this mystery, you need to do it more in an archaeological fashion, piece by piece.
The atmosphere at the dig site changed from naive optimism to deep mistrust. It said Arnold and his team grew suspicious of the Mexican.
Dave Arnold and the group of treasure hunters don't trust what the Mexican's telling them. They think that he's making them dig in places that they shouldn't be digging, drawing them away from the treasure.
Some of the men believed the Mexican wanted the treasure for himself. But before they could confront him with their suspicions, he disappeared.
Where did he go? Why did he leave? Nobody knows for certain other than the fact that Arnold seems very satisfied that he left and does not seem to miss him that much.
The next day, one of Arnold's men made a discovery.
They look over the excavation, and beyond where they had stopped the evening or so before, then they find the impression of a pot in that excavation.
It appeared some pots had been removed recently. Could they have contained the gold they'd spent so long looking for?
Arnold and his team must be thinking that he has removed something of extreme value, and they feel like something wonderful has been found and very valuable. They are probably interested in retrieving that material.
It's now the story took a darker turn. Shortly after the Mexican's disappearance, Arnold's men stumbled upon a body.
The party discover a grisly thing across the river, not too far from the excavation. And it is apparently a decomposed body near some heavy copper pots. And they assume that this is the Mexican sheep herder.
According to reports, the shape of the copper pots matched the impressions found earlier at the excavation site. Both were empty. Arnold's crew began to speculate.
Where did the contents of the pot go? Who took them? And doubt begins to build in their mind. Perhaps Arnold had a hand in this. We don't know. We can't prove it. But perhaps.
No one has been able to solve the mystery of the body by the riverbank. But one thing is clear. Arnold still believed the bulk of the treasure was intact. But with the sheep herder gone, he couldn't decipher any more clues from the spider rock. With no new leads, the excavation wound down.
The farmers and the ranchers have neglected their stock, neglected their crops, and they begin to drift away one by one. And it seems that at this point, Arnold himself has come to a dead end.
The treasure hunter gathered up the mysterious spider rock, along with the puzzling metal artifacts, and then disappeared. But Dave Arnold was not done looking for the fabled Spanish gold. In 1905, he reappeared, 70 miles southeast of the Brazos River site, near the tiny settlement of Clyde. And at a ranch run by John and Lucretia Sembritsky.
The Sembrinskys were farmers in Callahan County who originally are German settlers to the U.S. Being farmers, the Sembrinskys probably grew cotton or wheat or vegetables. They probably had chickens and pigs. They're just humble, poor, hard-working American farmers.
The Sembritskys welcomed Arnold into their home. Eyewitnesses recalled that at dinner, he struck up a lively discussion.
During this conversation, Arnold skillfully guides the subject around to strange things. Just how he did this, we don't know for certain, but he appears to have been a master at directing conversation the way he wanted it to go.
The Sembritskys were unaware that Arnold was hunting for information. He wanted the location of specific clues marked on his sheepskin map. 2 entwined trees and a pile of rocks. He suspected both were on the Sembritsky's farm, and that they held the key to uncovering the lost Spanish treasure.
And he begins to ask questions. Did you ever see anything strange around here? Have you seen any trees twisted together?
And Mrs. Sembritsky says, yes, I have seen them in an 80-acre southern part of the ranch. And Dave Arnold gets real excited, and then they get excited.
A short time after Lucretia Sembritsky's disclosure, Dave Arnold found the entwined trees and the pile of rocks. Reports say that he immediately started digging. Late in the afternoon, he made another discovery: an unidentified object just inches beneath the soil.
And he ran as fast as his legs would take him to the Sembritsky house and told him that he had found what he was looking for and please come and help him.
With John Sembritsky's help, Arnold freed the object. It was another spider rock. Carved into one side were puzzling diagonal channels framed by square partitions. Scattered about were what appeared to be numbers, letters, and cryptic symbols. On the other side were 4 concentric circles. The rock was strikingly similar to the one Arnold had found years earlier near the Brazos River site.
What a coincidence. Or is it a coincidence? Could they be tied in? I imagine that the thoughts, the questions racing through Arnold's mind at this time are just staggering.
Later that day, Arnold told the Sembritskys his theory about the rock's purpose.
And the family are looking around in great anticipation when Arnold starts revealing what he's come there to find and what this stone is telling him that will be found.
It's only now that Arnold finally revealed what he'd been seeking for the past 4 years. The stone was a map to a lost underground city, stacked with gold bars.
He is seeking $60 million in gold bullion, Spanish bullion. They had a hidden city, a buried city there, the Spaniards did, and this is where they left the treasure when they had to leave the country in a hurry because of the Native Americans that were attacking them.
$60 million of gold in 1905 would today be worth almost $1.5 billion. Arnold claimed the underground city could only be accessed through a secret tunnel. Find its entrance, and they would find the treasure. The Sembritsky's were amazed and eagerly agreed to allow Arnold to excavate their property.
He was convincing enough, or he showed John Sembrinsky something that was convincing enough to make him quit his farming duties and dig for treasure.
If somebody's telling a fantastic story and there's a possibility of a great amount of treasure or gold to be found, you're going to put all your effort into helping this man.
But Arnold didn't tell the Sembritskys the full story. He didn't say he dug for treasure years earlier and failed to find the gold. He didn't tell them of his discovery of the first Spider Rock, nor of the Mexican sheepherder's mysterious death.
Arnold is apparently a master at manipulation. He recognizes the desperate need that the Sembritskys have just simply to survive. And he plays upon this. And the Sembritskys fall right into his trap.
The Sembritsky farm dig began in mid-1905. Very soon, Arnold uncovered mysterious artifacts. Strange copper objects, cut into the shapes of daggers and crowns. The similarity to those found at the Brazos riverside was obvious. Whether Arnold knew what they signified is not known. But to him, they were evidence he was closing in on the underground city. And soon, he made a startling discovery. Just beneath the Texas soil, he found brickwork.
Dave Arnold believed that it was the archway, the doorway into the secret tunnel that would lead him to the special treasure room where all the bullion would be found.
Arnold felt sure he was close to striking it rich. He approached his old associate, Caleb Terrell, to finance a full-scale excavation. The pharmacist injected his own funds into the project. Arnold hired local muscle to shift the tons of soil covering the underground treasure vault. And they began stripping the Sembritsky's farm.
He made this 100-square-foot area, kind of like a prairie dog town, just digging randomly wherever he might think he could get into something.
The digging continued at breakneck speed. Even when water started pouring into the excavations.
The only problem is you dig down 29 feet and the water table at Clyde is about 29 feet. So water fills in the tunnel, and they didn't have scuba diving equipment at that particular time.
But Arnold was not giving up. He ordered holes dug all over the site in a desperate bid to find the underground city.
And at this moment, Dave Arnold is crapshooting. he can't find the way into the chamber that he's seeking.
By autumn 1905, the Sembritsky's farm resembled a battlefield, peppered with deep holes and flooded shafts.
There are holes, excavations, trenches, piles and piles of dirt everywhere made by hand, shovel, pick, and greed.
But the underground city and the Spanish treasure were nowhere to be found. Dave Arnold was not one for quitting. He now sought help from an unlikely source. The American enlisted a Mexican seer to find the treasure.
I don't think it was at all unusual for Dave Arnold to bring in a clairvoyant. The man was groping for any help he could find.
And this was an age when people did believe in the supernatural.
At that particular time, it is viewed as a gift, and these people have a power to find things that are lost.
The seer communed with a mysterious rock. What he saw horrified him.
He warned Arnold that anyone who sought this treasure would suffer dire consequences, that there was a terrible curse placed upon this treasure.
Leave it alone. You'll have nothing but heartache from this. And that wasn't what Dave Arnold wanted to hear.
To a man like Arnold, the seer's talk of curses and disaster probably sounded ridiculous. But it's then things started to go very wrong. First, John Sembritsky fell out with Arnold.
Dave Arnold turns to the wife, and she begins to spend some time with him. He does have a magnetism, and John Sembritsky recognizes this and becomes jealous. He even accuses Arnold of having an affair with his wife.
And when that sort of thing happens, everything just kind of falls apart.
To make matters worse, evidence from Dr. Terrell's account books suggests the excavation's costs were mounting. Tensions on site rose. Eyewitnesses recalled Arnold arguing with his associates. He even started arming himself.
Dave Arnold was sleeping with his pistol. He'd wear it during the day, and when you're wearing pistols at a work site, you may have problems.
Arnold's dream of finding the lost Spanish treasure had crumbled. It was now the end of the road for him at the Sembritsky's farm in Clyde. He gathered up the stone map and all the copper artifacts found at the site. And then he left. The story goes, Arnold later deposited them in the safe at Caleb Terrell's pharmacy in Haskell. Afterwards, he disappeared for a second time.
Dave Arnold was devastated at the trials of problems that took place at Clyde, but Dave Arnold is not one to give up.
In 1909, Dave Arnold and Caleb Terrell reappeared. 70 miles northwest of Clyde, near the small settlement of Rotan in Fisher County. And once again, they were on the trail of treasure.
He won't take no for an answer. He does not give up. He will not give up.
As with the quests near the Brazos River and Clyde, it's likely they found this site by decoding clues on Arnold's sheepskin map. Historians know very little about the search at Rotan, except that one afternoon, Arnold made a discovery close to a small creek. A third spider rock. On one side were two concentric circles. On the other, bizarre, irregular markings, bisected by two parallel lines. The stone featured intriguing circles and pictograms, just like those on the other two spider rocks. But just as with those stones, their exact meaning and significance was a mystery.
Although some of the symbols are the same, there are new and different symbols, symbols which he cannot interpret. At this point, Arnold is virtually alone, with no one to assist him in interpretation, no one to tell him, dig here.
Dave Arnold's quest had hit the buffers once again. But that is not the end of the story, nor the misfortune that had plagued the hunt for the lost Spanish treasure. In October 1908, Dr. Caleb Terrell had declared himself bankrupt. Funding Dave Arnold's excavations destroyed his family's wealth and likely left him a broken man. Then, on the night of the 7th of May, 1909, his drugstore in Haskell burned to the ground.
Apparently, Dr. Terrell never knew there was a fire. He died about that same night. There's the curse for you.
Inside the safe were two of the stone rocks and many of the metal artifacts found near the Brazos River and Clyde.
And the story was that everything was destroyed. That was the story that was always told. That ended the story. Everything burned up in the fire.
When the Terrell Pharmacy burns, it seems to be the end of the road for Arnold. If at any other time in his career he thought about a curse, this must have been the crowning curse of all.
Historians know very little of Dave Arnold's quest following the Haskell drugstore fire. Evidence suggests he continued his search around Texas, but he failed to find the treasure he sought. Arnold died in 1911. But was the treasure hunter's quest a waste of time? Had there ever been anything out there to find? The answer may lie in the objects that Dave Arnold unearthed. His excavations found evidence of copper smelting, parts of a Spanish officer's uniform, and the possible remains of buildings. Some historians believe this leads to an obvious conclusion.
All the evidence points to lost Spanish mines in the early 1800s. They were seeking copper and they were seeking lead. They had to have lead for the bullets and copper for the vessels. And whatever those stone maps relate to relates back to the mining sites.
One theory is that the stone maps are elaborate markers the Spanish left behind to help them one day relocate their valuable mines. If this is true, there exists no stash of gold, only rich veins of copper and lead ore. But other historians believe the mysterious rocks Dave Arnold unearthed point to the existence of a more valuable prize.
The treasure definitely exists. Nobody goes to that much trouble by accident. Why make these elaborate markings to just depict some mining sites? So where there's smoke, there's fire.
If the legendary Spanish treasure exists, finding it could still be possible. The spider rock Arnold found near Rotan has survived to the present day, along with accurate rubbings of the other two rocks. These tantalizing clues may lead one lucky treasure hunter to the jackpot.
I think there's something there. I don't know that it's gold and silver bars stacked like cordwood in a cave, but I believe there's at least one or two archaeological sites, and I believe they're Spanish, that are begging to be discovered.
But until these sites are found, the Spider Rock's mystery promises to entice new generations of treasure seekers.
Treasure legends never die. There is always something that keeps them going. Spider Rock and its associated maps, they're always just beyond your reach. And that keeps the mystery alive.
In France, a tiny village has attracted treasure hunters for the last 70 years.
Rennes-le-Château is one of the most mysterious places on Earth.
It's got buried treasure, it's got secret codes, it's got conspiracies.
It's all because at the end of the 19th century, the priest of Rennes-le-Château, Béranger Saunière, became fabulously rich. And nobody quite knows how.
The big mystery about Saunière is where the money came from.
Some say the priest discovered buried treasure. But others claim Saunière uncovered a secret so profound, it could rock the foundations of the Catholic Church.
The truth is, Saunière is the tree that hides the forest.
mystery of where Saunier got his money is only superficial. There are other things that go a great deal deeper.
This is the true story of the treasures of Rennes-le-Château. In the Aude region in the south of France, in the foothills of the Pyrenees, lies the village of Rennes-le-Château. Here, in 1953, an elderly French woman lay on her deathbed. Marie de Nano was ill, and her health failing fast. Her friend, Noël Corbout, hung on her final words.
She said, "When I know that I am dying, not a moment before, then I will tell you a secret which will make you rich and famous."
It was a secret that could be worth millions.
Noël Corbout sits anxiously beside the bed, hoping that she will recover sufficiently to tell him what she'd promised.
It was the secret of the buried treasure her lover, Béranger Saunier, was supposed to have discovered 70 years earlier. It all began when Béranger Saunier was appointed the new priest of Rennes-le-Château.
When Béranger Saunier arrived in Rennes-le-Château in 1885, the place he had come to was a small, rather impoverished hilltop village.
It was not a promising place for an ambitious young priest to further his career in the church.
It had a population then of about 300. It was in a very dilapidated state, no water supply, just a rough track up to the village.
The church was pretty well dilapidated. The roof was leaking, the birds were flying in and out of the building through various holes in broken windows and in other places, and it was almost unusable.
Saunier's new church was originally a private chapel to the lords of Rennes-le-Château, who lived in the castle nearby, which gives the village its name. The church, like many others in the region, was dedicated to Mary Magdalene, which intrigued its new priest.
Saunier had a thing about Mary Magdalene. But of course, the reason that the church is dedicated to Mary Magdalene is because there is such a sort of cult of her and to her in that part of France.
Mary Magdalene's role in Christ's life has been the subject of debate within the church for millennia. The Bible says she was the only person who witnessed both Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. But then Mary Magdalene suddenly disappeared from the New Testament. Some legends say she fled to France, carrying the Holy Grail, the cup Christ was said to have drunk from at the Last Supper.
In this region, we have a centuries-old great tradition that Mary arrived here. The idea is that Mary Magdalene, like so many persecuted in Palestine, flees and finds refuge in Narbonne.
Myths about her life in the south of France flourished here in the Middle Ages. In the 12th century, a heretic sect known as the Cathars were said to have worshipped her and protected and hid a fabulous treasure that could even have included the Holy Grail itself.
Many mysteries derive from this period. The Cathar, the Templar, the Grail. That is why it is very important for all myths.
The Catholic Church brutally suppressed the Cathars. But their hidden treasure was never found. The myths of Mary Magdalene and Cathar treasure were well known to the new priest of Rennes-le-Château, Béranger Saunière. In 1885, Saunière's income was low. He had no money to renovate his crumbling church. Like a lot of priests at the time, he longed for more. And yet somehow, he had to get his church into a workable condition. Despite Saunière's meager income, he found enough to employ a housekeeper, Marie Denanot.
The relationship between Saunière and Marie Denanot was something rather more than that of a priest and his housekeeper.
She becomes Saunière's housekeeper and closest confidant for the rest of his life.
In 1886, Saunière said he received a donation from a sympathetic countess to renovate his crumbling church. During the works, something happened that would transform Saunière's life as a humble village priest.
During the renovations, the bell ringer, who used to ring the bells every day, comes down to where the work is taking place and sees a wooden pillar that had been supporting the pulpit lying on the floor. It was opened, and he sees inside a little bottle, a small phial. He picks it up and sees a bit of paper inside.
The bell ringer's great-grandson, Antoine Captier, still has the pillar that was said to have contained the phial.
He told us that he found a document in a wooden balustrade. In this balustrade there was a small piece of parchment. However, we don't know what happened to the document because my great-grandfather gave it to Saunière, and he just told him that it was just a bit of a relic.
Saunière took the parchment away for closer inspection. It appeared to be some sort of map indicating treasure below the church and the graveyard. Saunière ordered the floor of the old church to be lifted. His workers then made a startling discovery.
Shortly afterwards, Saunière found a pot full of gold coins and shiny objects, which was witnessed by the workers, and therefore fact.
Saunière quickly took the pot of coins away dismissing the find.
He wanted to make the workers believe they were worthless. The workers were naive, but not to that extent.
After this first discovery, Saunière became convinced there was more treasure hidden somewhere in the graveyard, in a crypt known as the Lord's Tomb.
We know from the records that this crypt exists, but we don't know where it is. I think this little parchment contains the location of where one can find the crypt of the Lord's tomb.
Many believe something else on the parchment has made Saunière think the Lord's tomb could contain the missing Cathar treasure. Possibly even the Holy Grail itself. The priest enlisted his housekeeper and now lover, Marie Dernanot, to help him find the tomb.
He searches at night, not in the church, but in the cemetery. And he starts to excavate the cemetery to reach the crypt from the outside. The work is quite complicated because he had to do it at night, and most of all hidden from the villagers.
But word soon spread of the nocturnal activities of the village priest.
The villagers are complaining that he's basically desecrating the graveyard. He's digging up graves, he's moving headstones, he's taking the old bones and putting them into an ossuary.
People talked about how he locked himself in the cemetery and they didn't see him until hours later. So he was looking for something underground.
Saunière's diary then recorded the night he discovered the Lord's tomb.
He writes everything down in his ledgers, the ledgers that I have studied. At a certain point in September 1891, he writes, "Discovery of a tomb. Evening, rain." It was that day that he goes under the church and finds the tomb of the Lords of Rennes.
Some say Saunière discovered a nobleman buried with jewelry and gold. But exactly what he found in the Lord's tomb, he never disclosed.
So what did he find? We don't know. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a secret. However, we are convinced that he found an entrance to a tomb, which led to a subterranean space, which then led him to somewhere else.
Soon afterwards, Saunière began to disappear for long periods of time, and on his return, continue to excavate the graveyard.
It's after the discovery of this tomb that Saunière starts behaving strangely. He's definitely up to something.
I think he was looking for money. He must have been lured by a small discovery of some buried jewelry belonging to the Lords of Rennes.
But something else, very strange was going on with Béranger Saunier. Marie would collect from the local post office up to 150 letters a day from all over the world and give them to Saunier. It was another secret they shared together. Whatever Saunier was up to, all of a sudden, he became fabulously rich.
As soon as he starts finding things underground in the cemetery, he starts paying for everything up front. We found he had about 100,000 francs in the bank. He's someone who suddenly gets into a lot of money.
When he first comes into money, he starts to spend it on the church. The weird decoration is put in, you know, the statue of the devil bearing the holy water stoup. There were about 90 anomalies in the decoration, things that are surprising or you wouldn't expect. Somebody wearing a kilt, for example, what's that doing in a biblical scene?
Some believe these strange decorations are clues as to what Saunier had found. What was the significance of two baby Jesuses in the church? One in the arms of Joseph, one in the arms of his mother Mary. What was Saunier trying to say?
One particular example is the big mural of Christ preaching on the hill. And at the foot of the hill, there lies a money bag. The money bag has a hole in it, and a gold coin is peeping through the hole, as if symbolically Saunier is saying in this picture, I have found treasure, I've used some, not much, and there's a great deal more to be used.
Some people regard this as kind of, in a way, a treasure map, directions to different places in the vicinity of Rennes-le-Château where eventually you're going to find the treasure.
Once his church was fully restored, Saunier unashamedly began to spend the money on himself.
He starts to buy up land in the village to construct his domain, his estate, his gardens. He has this villa built.
He was a man of great appetites in numerous directions, and his building displayed the luxury that he longed for.
Saunier pays for the construction of an extravagant new tower, the Tour Magdala, named after Mary Magdalene. Saunier even had llamas and a monkey put into his sumptuous new gardens. His new house, the Villa Béthanie, was used for showing off his new wealth, entertaining distinguished guests with expensive wines and food.
The invoices survive for the food and the drink that he bought to throw these parties. And it's vast amounts.
I found his bills. He ordered langoustine, a lobster, 50 liters of rum straight from Martinique. So he's really living the high life in Rennes-le-Château.
He almost does start to become like the king of Rennes-le-Château. He starts to produce postcards, not just of the village, but making sure that he's in the pictures. Almost as if he's suddenly thinks of himself as a celebrity.
Whatever money he had, he spent, and he lived like a medieval aristocrat would live.
In total, Saunier spent around 200,000 francs, the equivalent of several £1 million today. Saunier's spending was so extraordinary, the villagers of Rennes-le-Château started to ask themselves, where did all this money come from? Soon others started asking the same question. In 1902, the new Bishop of Carcassonne, Monseigneur Beauséjour, was appointed, overseeing Saunier's parish. Asked to explain his extraordinary spending to him, Saunier refused.
The new bishop was appointed who started putting his long pointed nose into what Saunier was doing and asking him to explain the source of his wealth, which Saunier stolidly refused to do.
Non, non, juste pour le mot. Juste pour le mot. Voici les livres. Non, je ne connais pas son secteur.
Saunier was removed from his post and banned from giving services. In defiance, he set up his own altar in the Villa Betanie and continued to attract worshippers. He refused to leave his estate.
He says, my possessions are here in Rennes, so I'm staying here. So actually, he chooses his possessions over spirituality.
Eventually, Saunier was put on an ecclesiastical trial in the Vatican, which he never attended. Instead, he sent expensive lawyers to fight his case. The trial lasted 6 years, and before it could reach a judgment in 1917, after years of high living, Saunier died of heart failure, caused by liver cirrhosis. Yet, for all his extraordinary spending, Saunier died penniless and without property in his name. It was said that to stop the church seizing his wealth, Saunier transferred his entire estate to his housekeeper and confidant, Marie Denarnaud.
The villagers say that she actually visited Saunier's grave every day and every night, so she obviously remained devoted to him.
In later life, Marie Denarnaud became a recluse, but was once seen wearing some of the jewelry Saunier was alleged to have found.
She's doing it so that the sunlight would shine on the antique jewelry with which she had encrusted both her hands. The neighbour said, "Oh, Marie, they're beautiful." She ran indoors, came back without them, and was never seen wearing them again.
The stories of Saunier's incredible discovery spread. Had he found the legendary treasure of the Cathars, or something even more extraordinary? What was the secret of the mysterious priest of Rennes-le-Château? The first answers to this mystery started to appear in 1946, almost 30 years after Saunier's death, when Noël Corbu and his family arrived in the village.
Noël Corbu is an interesting character because he's mainly a businessman with quite a few business ventures, but he's also had tried his hand at writing novels.
One day, there are people, the Corbu family, who lived nearby in Bugarache, going for a walk in Rennes-le-Château. They go to the bell tower and see that someone lives in the estate.
Corbus discovered the estate was owned by Marie Denano. Noël Corbus's daughter, Claire, remembers the encounter.
The first time we met Marie, when we were children, we thought she was like a real grandmother, dressed in black, very small. She loved to laugh, always smiling.
Having lived as a recluse for years, Marie was delighted with her new visitors.
My father really liked the place. He loved hilltop locations, castles, all these impressive things. My father really liked Miss de Narnaud's property.
After several visits, Noël Corbus was so enamored by Marie's estate in Rennes-le-Château, he offered her a deal.
He said, if we adopt you as a family member, as a sort of adopted grandmother, we will treat you to the very best of our ability. We will be your friends, we will be your family, we will take care of you in return for us having what had been Sonia's old estate.
Marie allowed the Corbus to run the estate, and little by little took Noël Corbus into her confidence, sharing with him the secret of her lover, Béranger Saunière, and their discovery of buried treasure. But she didn't reveal where the treasure was hidden. She told Corbus she would only do that at the moment she is about to die.
And then she gets a stroke. She can neither write nor speak. Noël Corbus sits anxiously beside the bed, hoping that she will recover sufficiently to tell him what she'd promised.
Marie died in 1953. Childless, she left her entire estate to the Corbus. And then the stories of what Marie had told Noël Corbus about Saunière began to emerge. In a series of sensational newspaper articles, Corbus revealed that Denano and Saunière had discovered a great hoard of treasure. But the treasure wasn't anything to do with Mary Magdalene, the Cathars, or the Holy Grail. It was something quite different, a treasure that was a king's ransom, a treasure that had been hidden and seemingly forgotten by history. Corbus said that in the 13th century, Blanche Castile, Queen Regent of France, had hidden her nation's entire treasury, some 18 million gold pieces and jewelry, somewhere under the church of Rennes-le-Château. It was to pay the ransom of her son, the future Louis IX, who had been captured by the Egyptians during the Crusades.
He loved this story, my father. He loved telling it to his clients, and he made a recording, so he didn't have to repeat it all the time.
According to Noël Corbus, Marie had said that she and Saunière had found just a fraction of the Blanche Castile treasure, and much more was still to be discovered.
Et elle lui dit, mon bon Noël.
She says to him, "My dear Noël, With what Saunière has left, we can feed Rennes for 100 years. She also tells him, you merely have to bend over to pick up gold.
Marie told Corbu that Saunière's frequent disappearances were when he would go abroad to sell bits of treasure and then send the money back by post. But Marie had died before she could reveal the really vital information, where the hoard was buried, taking the secret of the Blanche Castile treasure to her grave. But Corbu was certain it was down there somewhere.
She had convinced him that there was something of immense value waiting to be discovered. And he looked for it everywhere.
Soon, the entire Corbu family were treasure hunting.
As a child and a young girl, it was my principal activity, looking for the treasure. And with my brother, it was our most important hobby.
Given all the publicity surrounding Rennes-le-Château's buried treasure, Corbu opened a hotel and restaurant in Saunière's old estate to cater for the new flood of treasure hunters.
His clans were treasure hunters, drawn to the history of Rennes as told by my father.
Among them was one of the most famous treasure hunters in France. In 1958, Robert Charroux arrived in Rennes-le-Château.
Robert Charroux was the president of the Treasure Hunters Club in France. He had written several books. He was very well known for treasure hunting. And in Rennes, it caused a lot of publicity.
Charroux used metal detectors to search for the treasure's hiding place in the church and the cemetery. But despite all his experience, Charroux couldn't find the treasure, which quietly pleased Noël Corbu.
I think Charroux said he was convinced that my father-in-law knew a lot more than he let on. Maybe that is why he never succeeded.
Corbu and Charroux' stories spread like wildfire throughout France. So much so that in 1961, French channel ORTF made a program about the mystery. Such was his deep involvement in the creation of the myth, Corbu himself played the part of Saunière. Like many, treasure hunter Jean Brunelin was drawn to the stories of Béranger Saunière.
It is treasure that has brought me to Rennes-le-Château. We heard stories here and there. Someone made a hole here, others made a hole there. Someone used a drill to blow air from one side to see if it came out the other.
But after years of treasure hunting and several official archaeological digs, no treasure was ever found.
This treasure hunting in and around Rennes became so intense and became, the whole place was honeycombed with these tunnels. And in 1965, further excavations were banned.
But the story was about to take a new, dramatic twist and lead to even more extraordinary theories about Saunière's wealth. It was all to do with the parchment that was supposed to have been found in the pillar that first set Saunière off treasure hunting. Everyone believed it had been lost forever. But in 1967, a book by journalist Gérard Desède sensationally claimed Saunière had found not one, but 2 parchments, and published them for the first time.
The step between it becoming kind of a regional sensation to a national one to an international one, the big step there is a book called The Gold of Rennes.
According to Desède, Saunière had taken the parchments to his bishop, who had advised him to take them to the highest church authorities in Paris. Desède claimed when Saunière returned from Paris, he was suddenly rich beyond his wildest dreams. So had he found a great treasure after all? Desède's co-author, Pierre Plantard, appeared in a BBC interview to give some clues to their theory.
Will the treasure of Rennes-le-Château ever be found?
Ici, vous me parlez d'un trésor matériel. Ne parlons pas de trésor matériel. Disons simplement qu'il existe un secret à Rennes-le-Château.
But if Plantard and Desède were right, and Saunière hadn't found a material treasure, what had he found that had made him so rich?
What they do, they take the Saunière story, the Rennes-le-Château mystery as it originally was, and use it as the hook for a whole other story.
Desède and Plantard claimed the parchments held a secret to prove that the lineage of the last Merovingian king of France, Dagobert II, hadn't died out but still existed today, and that a shadowy organization called the Priory of Sion was founded to protect it. A few years later, it was then a British author, Henry Lincoln, who said he had separately decoded Desède's parchments and took the story even further. He claimed that the parchments were a series of clues that sensationally proved Mary Magdalene had indeed fled the Holy Land for France, but did so when pregnant with Jesus' child. And that Christ's bloodline became the French Merovingian kings, of whom the mysterious Pierre Plantard was the only living survivor. The Holy Grail was known as the Saint Graal, but it wasn't a cup at all, but the Saint Real, meaning royal blood. And this was Saunière's great secret. Lincoln appeared on American television to reveal his discovery.
The mystery which triggered the discovery which we eventually made, which triggered the whole course of research, was concerned with a small village in France where a priest had apparently found a treasure. We looked into the history of that area, and the Grail kept surfacing. And the Grail, in turn, leads us into the bloodline.
The bloodline was the Holy Grail, and Saunière had discovered it on the parchments. It was an earth-shattering claim that could shake the Catholic Church to its foundations.
It was a huge bombshell for all kinds of reasons. Not only Jesus fathered children, with all the implications that has for our understanding of Christ and Christianity, but also that descendants of that bloodline are still around today.
The revelations seemed to turn the story of the Bible on its head. The bloodline secret was the source of Saunier's wealth. It wasn't the Blanche of Castile treasure, but a huge bribe from the Vatican to keep him quiet. However, just a year later, it was announced that the parchments were in fact forgeries. It was all a huge hoax by Plantin and de Sède. Henry Lincoln wasn't part of the hoax, but a victim of it.
This book is like a punch in the face. It's not possible. In this book, he talks of Merovingians, Order of Sion, spies. It's not possible. So we investigated all these clues from the Sède, but in fact, the Sède was tricking us. We were hooked, and he was just reeling us in.
What their motivation was, nobody knows. A lot of people have regarded it as a bizarre bit of performance art.
But the story didn't end there. 20 years later, the hoax became the basis for one of the best-selling books of all time. Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code took de Sède and Plantin's invention of the Priory of Sion and Jesus' bloodline to a whole new level.
The story of Rennes-le-Château still generates an extraordinary frenzy amongst treasure hunters and writers. For commercial reasons, this mystery is much more interesting to claim that Saunier kept a terrible secret.
But if the source of Saunier's wealth wasn't a huge bribe from the Vatican, what was it? It certainly wasn't by finding the Blanche Castile treasure, as told by Noël Corbu. There is no record of this treasure in any history book. While it is true that Louis IX had been captured, the ransom was paid and he was released. So where had all Saunier's money come from? The answer, it seems, may lie in the 150 letters Saunier was getting daily. What was shown during the trial was that the letters weren't the proceeds of selling treasure, as Marie had said, but something far more grubby. By mail order, Saunier had been dishonestly selling prayers to people around the world, known as trafficking in masses. According to church rules, a priest was allowed to say 3 masses a day. Saunier was getting requests to say hundreds. And by doing this, Saunier had accumulated a fortune.
Alors, comme il a trafiqué les messes.
So, how did he traffic in masses? He was very good. He invented something we are still doing today. He put ads in magazines. Poor priest in a poor village needs masses to restore the church. He received a lot of money.
This, then, was Saunier's secret. He was a highly enterprising crook.
It's in Saunier's temperament. He wants to make money from everything. From the moment he finds a new source of income, he is going to use it. He had actually made the biggest part of his fortune by trafficking in masses. But he was also an agent for booze, an agent for oil, he produced postcards, he made money out of everything, and he made a lot of money.
But if Saunier was just a crook, why had Marie always claimed that he had found treasure?
les paysans du village, vous voyez.
The villagers see him build this nice villa, buy land and give money to everyone. They think it's weird. And afterwards, smart Marie, to give people a reason, says that he has found a treasure. This explains everything.
But the other reason is that after Saunière died, she was almost destitute. Marie needed someone to support her. She had spun a yarn to the Corbeaus.
Mais là, elle est maligne, la Marie.
She is smart, Marie. Marie is always scared. She has nothing. What can I do if these people throw me out on the street? To keep them interested, she says, at the end of my life, Monsieur Corbeau, I will tell you something that will make you powerful.
So was Corbeau just naive, a victim of Marie's story? Or perhaps he had reasons to believe.
Corbeau was a very successful businessman, and when he arrived in Rennes, what he needed was to make the place a universal attraction. And so whatever the attraction is, whatever the mystery is, the more you can make of it, the more tourists you will attract.
When Corbeau first came to Rennes, there were only on average 200 tourists a year. Nearly 70 years later, thanks to Marie and Corbeau's stories, and more recently, the Da Vinci Code, tens of thousands visit to learn the strange tale of the treasures of Rennes-le-Château. And even though so much has been revealed to be a hoax, many continue to search for the tomb containing treasure, or a secret.
You have the feeling that when you come to Rennes-le-Château, you can solve an enigma. I think that explains its global success. It is a game in which you can play a role. In the end, we all need dreams. Who needs the truth when we can have a mystery?
In Rome, deep in the heart of the Vatican, they say there is an amazing object.
It becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Not a painting or icon, but a true image of Jesus Christ. It is called the Veil of Veronica.
The Veronica was believed to be a piece of fabric that touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Venerated for over 1,000 years, this was once the most prized relic in Christendom and an object of pilgrimage. But one man has a shocking revelation. He believes the object in the Vatican is a fake. And he knows because he's found the real one. This is the story of Paul Badder's journey of discovery to find what had happened to the true face of God.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
If he is right, his discovery could have huge implications for the history of the Church and for the future of Christianity itself.
It was the first time for around 500 years that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ.
The story began at a dinner in Turin, when journalist and author Paul Bader met German art historian Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. Father Pfeiffer told Paul an amazing tale that, if true, could rewrite history, be the most significant discovery in Christianity, and show how what was once one of the most venerated objects in the Vatican could be a fraud.
I raised my glass to him and thought he must have been crazy.
The story revolved around a fabulous relic, the Veil of Veronica, whose origins are immortalized in most churches as the so-called sixth station of the cross. The stations of the cross take us through Christ's last terrible journey to his execution.
Every church has these images that we call the Stations of the Cross, and that allows us to accompany Jesus as he makes his way from his condemnation to death by Pontius Pilate right up to the moment of crucifixion and his burial.
Step by step, the stations tell the tale of the horrific suffering Jesus faced in the lead-up to his death.
He was scourged and crowned with thorns before he carried the cross through the narrow streets of Jerusalem.
Along the way, Jesus is met by friends and supporters who share in his pain and suffering. One of them was said to be a woman known as Veronica.
A pious woman of Jerusalem saw Christ suffering and bleeding and sweating, and she took her sweat cloth, which was a cloth she was wearing around her head, and gave it to him to dry his face from blood and sweat.
The legend has it that when Christ handed the cloth back to her, miraculously, an image of his face had transferred to the material. But it is only a story. Veronica herself is not actually mentioned in the Bible.
The legend of Veronica is moving us because it is a legend of compassion and love and a miracle. And it allows us to have an image of Christ.
Whatever its actual origin, stories of a cloth bearing a miraculous image of Christ, not made by human hands, continued to circulate throughout the early Christian period.
There's a whole interconnected network of legends about a miraculous image of Jesus' face, which seem to come from different sources and have different motivations behind them.
Somehow, this miraculous cloth with its image of Christ made its way to Rome.
The first documented evidence of the Veronica being in Rome is from 705, when Pope John VII built a shrine for the Veronica.
By 1200, the Veronica was on permanent display in St. Peter's Basilica, and thousands of people flocked to see it. This image became hugely important to the world of art. Until then, artists had no idea of what Jesus actually looked like. There are no clues in the Gospels, so they depicted him in an idealistic or general way.
There are images of Jesus in the catacombs and elsewhere from the 2nd and 3rd centuries where Jesus just looks like a normal young Roman man, clean-shaven, a bit plump. You can only identify him by the fact that he's performing a miracle, and he's normally doing it in the way that a Roman god would do. So, for example, he's curing someone by touching them with a stick.
But when the Veronica appeared, all that changed. Now, artists and worshippers could look at an actual image of a real face.
It was very visual, and especially in the Middle Ages, the visual side of the faith was tremendously important. Having this imprint of Christ's face was almost as good as having a photograph.
You had an idea how God, who became man, really looks. God was not an idea, It was a face. God got a face, a human face.
This same face was seen and copied by many of the great artists and appeared in more and more works. It became the model for Jesus. The characteristics are always the same: the parted hair, the thin beard, the nose and mouth.
The Veronica was copied widely, and the simplified image of Christ's face was distributed across the world.
In fact, this image became so popular that a whole guild of specialist artists was created just to meet the demand.
From the middle of the 14th century, you get really clear evidence for people who are reproducing the Veronica and reproducing the holy images of Rome and selling those on as copies, but copies which bear the same spiritual authority and miracle-working power that the original did.
The Veronica proved not only a potent symbol, but also a great source of revenue as an object of pilgrimage.
The Veronica becomes a very important relic in Rome, that there's a chapel dedicated to it in St. Peter's. It soon becomes even the symbol of pilgrimage to Rome. So it becomes one of the real marvels of the city and one of the chief things that a pilgrim would go and see and venerate.
Successive popes used the Veronica to increase their prestige and influence.
Innocent III is particularly interested in promoting the Veronica, in part to promote the city of Rome itself and to encourage the pilgrimage to Rome.
Pope Innocent III granted indulgences for those who prayed before the Veronica, gave it its own feast day, and even promenaded it around the city.
The highlight of the Holy Year was the showing of the Veronica, because this was the encounter with Christ on earth when you were still alive.
Eventually, the Veronica became big business. Numbers visiting Rome became so vast that the decision was made to tear down the old Basilica of St. Peter's and rebuild it.
One of the ways in which popes of the early Renaissance proclaimed their authority and created their legacy was through major building projects. And St. Peter's is a good example of a Renaissance pope crafting his legacy with an oversized building project.
Dominating the center of this magnificent new basilica is the altar, which according to tradition was built above the tomb of St. Peter.
And then around it, they have these 4 pillars where they place the relics which were so popular in the Middle Ages: the head of St. Andrew, the veil of Veronica, the Holy Lance, and also part of the True Cross. And each of these relics, in a sense, being a cornerstone, a pillar of this new Basilica of St. Peter's, the heart of the church.
In other words, the Veronica had become one of the great pillars of the Catholic Church. But then Rome entered a dark period of disruption and violence, and everything changed. On the 6th of May, 1527, Rome was looted and attacked, ironically, by the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor.
The sack of Rome was a catastrophe for the Roman Church. For 1,000 years, Rome was a safe place, where all the pilgrims and the kings and the emperors who came to Rome left important donations at St. Peter.
In an orgy of violence, 500 men were slain in front of the altar, and many of the relics it had housed disappeared.
According to the contemporary reports, the most important relics were given away in a pub, and drinking soldiers were drying their mouth with the veil of Veronica.
In time, the dust settled, and the new St. Peter's Basilica was finally completed and consecrated. But by then, something had obviously changed. Although the Vatican still claimed to have the Veronica safe, It was no longer on public display, and on the rare occasions when it was shown, it seemed to look different.
Suddenly, the Veronica was not a clear, shiny image anymore, but a dark cloth with some traces of blood.
It led some to wonder if the original face of God had been lost.
So the big question is, what happened to the original Veronica, the beautiful Veronica, which was painted by the painters in the Middle Ages? It disappeared. And here we have the discovery of Father Pfeiffer.
At the dinner in Turin, Father Pfeiffer outlined his theory to Paul Bader, that the real face of God was no longer in the Vatican. Paul was skeptical. He had been warned of Pfeiffer's fantastical claims before. But Father Pfeiffer went further, claiming he knew where the real Veronica was now. 120 miles away, in a small town called Manapello.
He said, yes, there is something quite unknown on a little remote hilltop in the Abruzzi Mountains. He said, how come the whole world doesn't know of it? He said, yeah, that's a mystery. And, you know, he made it even more mysterious. And so it was just completely unbelievable.
Paul dismissed the whole theory.
I thought it's a fine story, but that was it. I wasn't even curious about it.
But this chance meeting would prove to be a turning point in Paul's life. Some months later, whilst traveling with his daughter down the Adriatic coast, Paul found himself near Manapello, and the church that Father Pfeiffer had claimed was the home to the real Veronica.
Then we got there and I thought it was about lunchtime, so maybe we could have a little lunch up there and have a look at it.
The town of Manapello, nestled within the mountainous region of Abruzzo, is in a remote area, off the beaten track, and largely forgotten by the outside world.
We got off the highway, the restaurant was closed, and I got here to the church.
Walking into the church, Paul saw the image for the first time.
The church had a mass, and after the mass I got up there, and this image was just, I mean, he looked at me.
Paul was immediately struck by the eyes, the gaze of Christ on this transparent image.
Seeing somebody's face is really seeing the person. You know, looking into somebody's eyes, looking at their expression, we can learn so much about that person. We believe that God became man in Jesus Christ, and to be able to see that face as it existed in his humanity, it would be a wonderful link with the divine nature.
Paul noticed that the material was so fine that in certain light, the image almost vanished, only returning when illuminated by a torch.
It is constantly exposed. And you can walk nearby, you can walk around, you can take pictures from any direction, and you can see how the light from the many windows in the church go through it. You can put your hand behind it, you can see your hand. You can put a newspaper behind it, and you can read the newspapers because it is so thin and so fine. And when you get very close to it, you see that the image itself is translucent. You don't see any color.
Paul could have gazed at the image forever, but was pressed for time.
My daughter, she was very impatient. She said, let's get off, I'm hungry, let's have something to eat. So she dragged me away, but I had to look at it one more time. And then he looked at me as if somebody who would just be awakening.
Deeply affected, but not sure of what he'd just seen, Paul couldn't bring himself to believe it was the real thing. And after leaving, put it to one side. Two years passed, and after working abroad as the Jerusalem correspondent for the German daily newspaper Die Welt, Paul returned to Rome. It was here that the Veronica reappeared in his life once again.
Saw around the corner, I saw a little poster announcing, not a press conference, a lecture of a certain Pater Pfeiffer. That's my Pater Pfeiffer. So I have to see him. I have to see him again. I have to see what he's going to tell me about the image.
Father Heinrich Pfeiffer is a German Jesuit scholar specializing in medieval religious art.
Father Pfeiffer is one of the leading art historians of the Christian world. A highly educated man and very important art historian.
During the course of the lecture, Father Pfeiffer reiterated his claim that the Manopello image is the veil of Veronica. During the talk, Paul was struck by the detail in the magnified close-ups. Seeing them brought a sudden revelation. It was real, and he believed in it.
And I thought, this is it. It must be, everything must be true. But these images, there's no comparison to it. I hadn't seen photos like this before.
He was so fascinating, but it became the mission of his life to spread the message of the human image of God around the world.
Paul was desperate to tell the world about these miraculous images and write a book, but he knew how hard it would be to convince people. It was a formidable challenge. He would need a lot of evidence to win over skeptics. The first question is, how can there even be a face displayed in Manopello if there is already a veil of Veronica in the Vatican?
Every year on Passion Sunday at 5:00 p.m., you can see what today is venerated in St. Peter as the Veronica, because the canons of St. Peter's appear on the balcony and bless the faithful with the modern-day Veronica, which is in a huge, heavy silver frame. But you can't see a human face.
Drawing on all his Roman contacts, he tried to secure a meeting with the Vatican authorities. Eventually, in summer of 2004, after much persistence, he was granted an audience with Professor Arnold Nesselrath.
He's a director of the Vatican Museums. He's a very prestigious position. He's a highly respected person in the world of art.
Keen to learn the Vatican's angle on the Manopello image, Paul met with Professor Nesselrath. He eagerly showed him pictures of the Manopello face. And questioned the professor about what it could be. But Professor Nesselrath would not be drawn into the debate about the Manopello image.
He had heard something of it, and he had heard something of Pater Pfeiffer. And he was from the big front who had decided about Pater Pfeiffer that he's not to be taken serious.
Professor Nesselrath would neither lend any credence to the Manopello image, nor let Paul see the Vatican's Veronica. When pressed to go and examine the image in Manopello for himself, the professor declined, claiming it was beyond his jurisdiction. The official channels had got him nowhere, he needed a different approach for his investigation. If he can't see the Vatican's image, he needed to find out more about the one in Manapello. When had it arrived, and how had it got there?
The problem with something like the image of Manapello is that there just isn't a paper trail, basically. So we know this object has been here in Manapello for a certain amount of time. We know that it arrived there under certain circumstances, but before that, who knows, basically. There's just no way of telling.
Paul realized that if it is real, then the most likely time for its arrival in Manapello would have been around 1527, during the sack of Rome. And there seemed to be a link. Paul's research showed that Pope Clement took refuge in the Castle Sant'Angelo after the sack of Rome. Something as valuable as the Veronica wouldn't have been left behind. Whilst waiting for the looting to end, Paul thought it possible that the commander of the castle had it spirited away to safety, far from Rome. Intriguingly, the commander had an estate in Manapello, and it all seemed to make sense.
One very realistic perspective is what Bari believes in, that the Castello Sant'Angeli, who had land in Manapello, safeguarded it and brought it there to protect it.
But confusingly, there is another version of events.
In 1506, a stranger appeared in Manapello and gave it to a local. And this local wanted to ask questions, but suddenly the stranger disappeared and he believed he was an angel.
This didn't add up, as 1506 is 21 years before the sack of Rome. Paul then looked at what was happening in Rome during this period and discovered very little was written about the Veronica for 100 years after the sack of Rome, until the consecration of St. Peter's Basilica in 1626. Officially, the Veronica was still there, housed within one of the 4 famous pillars. But Paul discovered something puzzling. In 1629, Pope Urban VIII stopped the veil being displayed. The lucrative trade in copies was prohibited, and he demanded all existing copies be destroyed on pain of excommunication. It was as if someone was trying to hide something.
It was important to recall all the images of the Veronica which has disappeared, and to wait until it disappears from the memory of pilgrims and Christian faithful.
Paul discovered that the story of an angel bringing the image to Manapello first appeared during the time the images were being destroyed. When the Manapello image was scrutinized, 12 townspeople came up with the story that their face of God was brought to them by an angel long before the sack of Rome. To Paul, now this story made sense. The villagers had used this tale to pretend their image couldn't possibly be of the real Veronica, and by doing so, had protected their image from destruction.
It was to disguise something. And then they invented a story, that an angel has brought it here, what you can do easily in Italy, because Italy is full of saints. Miracles are not strange to Italians.
Only after time had passed did the Vatican start showing the Veronica again. But it seemed different and much darker.
The replacement was not a good or bad copy, but something completely different. You had to destroy the original images and replace them by what you have. Later, the Vatican gave out new prints of the Veronica, which resembled what they have today. But this is a clear indication that the original relic disappeared and was exchanged.
The evidence for this can be found in art. Now, not only did it look completely different, so did the copies made by artists. It all seemed to suggest that the original had been lost. Paul was now certain that the original couldn't be in the Vatican, and that at some point the image was exchanged and a new one put in its place. But to prove that, he needed more evidence. He looked at early descriptions of the veil. In the past, it was recorded as being almost transparent. Even the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said it was like a translucent piece of linen. Unlike the blackened image in the Vatican, the Manopello image fitted that description.
There are many compelling reasons to think that that might be the case. The fact that the veil is transparent, that we can see through it, and we knew that was the case for the medieval Veronica.
Paul's attempts to see the Vatican's Veronica continued to be rebuffed. Thinking laterally, he decided to visit their vast treasury museum. He was looking for any evidence that would tie the Manopello image to Rome before 1527.
In the treasury of St. Peter's, there is a broken frame in which the Veronica was once kept. A frame that you could observe from both sides, just like in Manopello, and roughly the same dimensions.
For Paul, it was another clue. Only a transparent image that could be viewed from both sides would ever be displayed in this way.
To have a frame which is translucent only makes sense if you have a translucent cloth, like the veil of Manopello. The dimensions fit. And this is why we believe that the original Veronica, which was venerated in this frame, is what we today call the veil of Manopello.
If the true Veronica was still in the Vatican, why had this frame been smashed and the original cut away?
Taking all the information together which we have, there's no doubt about it. It must have been the sack of Rome.
Paul concluded it was the Manopello image that was torn from this smashed frame. The image even has a glass chip still embedded in it.
The whole story of this frame is giving even more credence to the theory of Professor Pfeiffer and Paul Bade that the true Veronica of the Middle Ages is a Manopello today.
It is a conflict about plausibility. If somebody comes up with a theory which is more plausible, I'm the first one to applaud it, the first one.
For Paul, the evidence linking the Manopello image to the original Veronica was conclusive. He was certain that they are one and the same. This now begged the biggest question of all. Could this really be the face of God? And if so, how had it been created? Paul went back to the original story and looked for clues. The problem is, Saint Veronica doesn't exist in the Bible.
One of the striking features of the Western version of the legend is the character of Veronica herself, a saint kind of created by clerical error, if you like. The name obviously derives from the Latin for the true icon, or Latin and Greek. The true image of Christ becomes the Vera Icone Veronica. You've invented a saint.
In other words, there never was a Veronica. Her name simply referred to the cloth itself.
The legend of Veronica was only one of many attempts to explain what we really have. But the name is revealing what we are talking about. Vera Iconia, the true image, was not the name of a woman, but the name of the image.
The implications of this are enormous. If Veronica did not exist, then the image could not have been created when she had wiped Jesus' face on the way to the crucifixion. So how did it get there? Paul examined the material itself and discovered how extraordinarily fine it was. It didn't look like linen or even silk. But what could it be? Researching on the internet, he came across an ancient fabric called byssus.
There are several types of byssus in antiquity, but the most precious one was created from the silk of a shell of a mussel. It's called Pinna nobilis. It's a very large Mediterranean mussel, 90 centimeters. Large thing.
Divers harvested byssus by hand. It took thousands of threads to make the smallest piece of silk. And as a result, it was extremely valuable. Byssus was so precious, it had long been revered as a religious material. Critically, it was used during the time of Christ.
It was the most precious fabric in the antique times. You find it in the graves of the pharaohs in Egypt. You find it in the cloth of the high priest, the ephod were made of byssus. In the curtain of the temple, byssus was mentioned. It's mostly translated in English, for instance, shining linen.
But was the Manapello image made of byssus? Continuing his research, Paul tracked down a woman in Sardinia, the last mussel silk cultivator. He flew her to Manapello to see the image for herself.
We brought her here to the image of the veil. She got onto her knees. She said, oh dear, that's byssus. That's mussel silk.
Byssus was far too valuable to have been used as something to mop up sweat. So how might the image have got there? Paul went back to the Bible to look for clues. After Jesus died, he was taken down from the cross and laid in the tomb with the different cloths needed for his burial. A shroud to wrap the body and a veil to cover his face.
Everybody was expecting to do the final burial on Sunday morning. That's why the women returned to wash and clean and embalm the body. When they came, the body had disappeared. The tomb was empty. He was not there anymore, because he was not dead anymore. He had risen.
In John chapter 20, there's that wonderful description of Peter and John running to the empty tomb. They've just heard from the women that Jesus is no longer in the tomb, and they go and investigate. The Gospels are very clear that when the disciples entered the empty tomb, there were various burial cloths lying around, not just the shroud, but amongst others, the cloth that was around the face of Christ.
Such a funeral veil would have been made of a fine, valuable material like byssus. Could it have been that whilst wrapped around Jesus' head, it had miraculously taken on the image of his face?
The Church clearly believes in the supernatural. It clearly believes in the miraculous. It clearly believes that the divine can work in the world. So it's certainly open to the possibility of images made without human hands. It was the image of a Christ who is alive, rather than the image that we find on the Shroud of Turin, the image of a dead man.
For the early Christians, it must have been a revelation that not only the body of the suffering Christ was imprinted on the burial cloth, but we also have the face of the resurrected Christ on a veil. And of course, both relics were venerated and given from generation to generation.
So could the Manopello image have been made by a miraculous process? Skeptics have often claimed that the Manopello image must just be a painting. But Paul discovered byssus has an unusual quality. You cannot dye or paint on it.
Paul Bade verified it is indeed not ordinary silk, but shell silk which you cannot paint. There are some very small pigments by medieval painters who try to refresh or to intensify colors in some point, or maybe even try to put fur images against it to get the replica blessed by the original. We call it second-class relic or relic by touch. But Paul Bade verified it is not a human being.
For Paul, all the pieces supporting his belief in the truth behind the Manopello image were fitting into place. From the Bible, he believed he had deduced what the cloth itself was used for.
Rather than being the cloth used by that pious woman as Jesus carried the cross, that it was actually one of the burial cloths of our Lord.
From paintings, he saw how the same image had been revered in Rome throughout the Middle Ages.
If you compare the Volto Santo of Manopello with all the paintings we have of the Veronica in Rome, they are identical. They're identical even in details.
And from the broken frame, he could see how it had been saved after the sacking of Rome and sent to Manopello, where it had been quietly forgotten for nearly 500 years.
It's so evident. This is the veil. There's no doubt about it. I mean, you could rip my skin off. I mean, this is it.
For Paul Bade, the story of Manopello's face of God was almost complete, and he could start writing up his theory. After completing his research, he sent all his evidence along with photographs to Pope John Paul II. It had been an incredible journey.
I couldn't believe it. But the whole story, every time and again, I had to pinch myself because it's a miraculous story.
Paul's work found a wide audience. Not only was it seen by Pope John Paul, but also by Cardinal Ratzinger, the leading authority on Catholic doctrine and thought, who complimented Paul on his work. And then, out of the blue on Sunday the 13th of March 2005, Paul Bade was granted an extraordinary opportunity to see the version of the Veronica in the Vatican. Making his way into St. Peter's, he was aware that this could be the final piece of the puzzle.
I don't know how come that I have seen it, that all of a sudden the doors opened, I could enter the column.
Within the Veronica column is a staircase leading to a small chapel housing the actual image itself.
Of course, Paul Bade has seen what they believe to be the Veronica in the Vatican right now and had the opportunity to see this relic from close by.
In the depths of the Veronica column, he finally saw the veil of Veronica. But it was a dark, unrecognizable image, nothing like the old artist's reproductions, and it was housed in a heavy, ornate picture frame. Clearly, this was a completely different image.
What I saw there, I saw a big silver frame. You see this hoax, that I might call it, or copy. Everything had disappeared.
He was even denied permission to photograph it. The Vatican have taken their own photos, but they are rarely shown.
The reason why they don't publish these pictures is they don't want to disappoint the faithful by revealing that there's no face on the Veronica anymore.
To this day, no pope has openly admitted that the Vatican Veronica ever disappeared, or that the barely visible face shown today is anything other than what had always been on display. But Paul had no doubt about what had really happened.
It was a trick. It was a trick from the 500 years ago, from these times of Machiavelli.
Paul is certain that this trick or hoax was deliberately perpetrated to maintain the illusion that the Vatican still had the real one. But if this had happened hundreds of years ago, why not admit it now?
I think there's no question that having the Veronica in your church, if you happen to be the Pope, would be an incredibly useful asset. You know, it's an item of incredible holiness and power. Everyone is awestruck by it. You're going to get a lot of people coming to see it, and it shores up your power, effectively, as leader of the church.
Confessing that this face has gone lost, it was a hard thing to do.
For Rome and her powerful popes, such a monumental loss of face would have been deeply embarrassing.
It's a catastrophe for the Church of Rome. We lost the face of God. Not the faith in God, but the face of God.
Paul thought there may have been another reason why the hoax was perpetrated. The Veronica had earned the church a lot of money.
They did not come to see St. Peter. They did not even come to see the Pope, as they do today. They wanted to see the veil.
Pilgrims had to be shown something, and that's just what happened. What started as a small hoax was simply allowed to continue until it became widely believed.
It's easy to dismiss it as just a cynical cashing-in exercise, and I'm sure it was partly a cynical cashing-in exercise, but it was also a way of making that pilgrimage real. I mean, remember, the whole idea of pilgrimage, at least in theory, is to take part in the physicality of something holy.
But others are more sympathetic about why the Veronica might have been replaced.
First of all, I have to disagree with both Father Pfeiffer and my dear friend Paul Bade in the idea that the canons of St. Peter perpetrated a hoax, a pious forgery, a pious fraud. I do not believe it. I believe they were hysterically searching for something and just took the second best and believed it because they wanted to believe it, that this is the right Veronica.
On April 2nd, 2005, Pope John Paul II died. He was succeeded by the man who had complimented Paul on his book, Cardinal Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI.
On the 1st of September 2006, Pope Benedict visited Manopello. Often he visited Italian shrines to venerate the relics or the local traditions. And there's that very evocative image of Pope Benedict just staring at the veil in Manopello. There's a real sense of an encounter, of encountering face to face with Christ. He was clearly very moved.
For Paul, this was the justification for all his hard work.
When he came to Manopello for the first Pope, Then he prayed here in silence. He bowed, he bent his knee in front of it. And then for more than 8 minutes, he's been in silent prayer in front of it. I mean, it was very, very moving.
It was the first time, for we believe around 500 years, that the Pope saw and venerated the true face of Christ, of the resurrected Christ.
Pope Benedict's visit changed everything.
A week later, on St. Peter's Square, in the next audience, he said, if we want to know who God is, then we only have to look into the face of his Son, and there we see who God is and how God is.
Although not actually authenticating the image, Pope Benedict's personal visit gave credibility to those that believed this was the true face of God.
He brought the image back into the world. That's what he did.
Paul and many of the faithful believe there is no doubting that this image is genuine. But there will always be skeptics. They want proper scientific evidence to show how the image got there and how old it is. The guardians at Manopello aren't against testing, as long as it is non-invasive and so doesn't damage the veil. They hope science will develop in the future, allowing for a more detailed examination which they are sure will vindicate their claims. If this happens, then the veil of Veronica would become one of the most significant discoveries in Christian history.
Just as the Veronica was a very popular relic in the Middle Ages, we're now entering a new period, a revival of this interest in the Holy Face, searching for the face of God, searching for that personal encounter with him.
St. Paul wrote in his letters, if Christ did not resurrect, our faith is worthless. So the veneration of the Volto Santo is concentrating the attention of Christianity back onto the image of the resurrected Christ. And that's important.